We're about to start. Excellent. Well, again, thank you very much. Right now, we're about to start the session on the roundtable on emerging markets panel. And I'd like first to start by letting the panelists introduce themselves. So please, Bob, would you start?
Okay, my name is Bob Jung. I'm with Google. I've been there about 5 years. I am the Director of Engineering for our Internationalization Engineering team. So they sent out a bunch of questions that they want us to sort of address. You know, like what markets we're addressing. You know, as you know, Google is trying to pretty global. We try to cover. Our goal is like 99% of people online, right? So as people have heard, we've got the 40 language initiative. We're now looking at going beyond the 40 because when we made the 40 languages 4 years ago, that was 99% of the market. Now we're only covering 98. So now we're looking at what are the languages we need to support, what are the countries we need to support. And that's sort of like our general enabling. Search works for that. Our ads are enabled for that. Our products, obviously, they have less coverage than that. And so in terms of looking at our products, we look at usage. You know, Google is all about data. We gather stats. We know what countries people are coming from. We know what languages they're trying to do things in. And so then that will promote what, you know, expand. We expand more products into more languages. You know, areas that we're looking at, the Middle East and Latin America are our two fastest growing markets right now. We also are spending a lot of effort in places like Africa. I think, you know, you can look at two ways we're sort of expanding. One is enabling people like places like Africa. We're trying to get more populations online, give them the power to have the internet at their disposal. And other markets where are fairly large. I mean, you know, the Arabic market, since I've been there 5 years, is, you know, as people come in, it's really, the rate of growth is huge. So they're online, so that's not a problem. Some of the problems are for these markets are there's not enough content. I mean, proportionally, content in English versus some places like the Arab markets, you know, the content is a much smaller ratio of proportion. And the other markets are a similar way. You know, what segments was the other question that we addressed, because, you know, we have different companies addressing different markets.
Bob, sorry to interrupt. If you don't mind, we'd like to do the introductions and then do the questions.
Okay, sorry. I thought they wanted to take about 5 minutes. Okay. 5 minutes. All right.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Kassan Haddad. Actually I have a similar role at Facebook. I'm Director of Internationalization. In reality, I actually focus more on translation than internationalization. I've been at the company for about 3 years, and my start at the company coincided with the point when Facebook was starting to go international. Okay, I went in, some engineers had done some research and decided they wanted to try to do this thing they called crowdsourcing. They developed, at that point, it was like a very interesting application, and since then, of course, it evolved quite a bit. In the first year, in 2008, we actually launched 35 languages, and the following year, another 35. If you add some languages that are not real, like Lead Speak and Esperanto and those, we have, I think, a total of 76 languages. There are some more in development. But just to give you a very brief overview of how we support those languages, there are the top languages that, in terms of user base and in terms of like the importance of the market from a business perspective, are all supported as well by an in-house team, as well as you know, contractors, localization companies. So we support internally close to about 25 languages. The remaining languages are 100% supported by our community. Okay. The interesting thing about the role of language, as Sulaiman was talking about, like it's not enough actually to translate in order to be able to expand. In reality, actually, that wasn't the case in our case, because if I've presented on this aspect previously, but with every language launch that we've had, we experienced a huge spike that actually continued over the months and years. And it was not unusual for our user base to grow from like 3 or 4x in 1 year, right after the translation part. Of course, further efforts related to the product targeting and things like that, and we've done quite a bit of that in order to be able to expand in emerging markets. That was helped quite a bit as well. The last thing I want to say is that our mission is to give people the power to share and make the world more open and connected. We don't say to make part of the world, or 50% of the world, or 70% of the world. So why we are in emerging markets? That's because, like Google, we want to be everywhere.
Excellent.
Hi, everybody.
All right.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nico Posner, Principal Product Manager for all things international at LinkedIn. And my responsibility includes localization of the website into multiple languages, as well as the product customization and building international specific products to serve our members outside the United States, which is over 50% of our member base. In general, emerging markets are one of the most critical growth drivers for us. Not surprisingly, because many of the most populated countries on the planet are in that category, and so the localization, not only from a translation perspective, but adaptation of our products to be relevant based on the professional networking practices in those markets is part of what I do every day.
Excellent. This is not working either. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, how does your prospective companies define an emerging market, and when is the point where you decide this is an emerging market, it's time for us to actually engage? I'm sure there's probably different milestones or different criteria. How would that work for each of your prospective companies?
How do we define emerging markets? Well, actually, we have different, we define emerging markets, we also define challenge markets. Markets that are not necessarily emerging, but we're not doing well. So we kind of try to attack both of those. But emerging markets obviously are the size of the market. There are a number of people in mind from the sales side, they look at the revenue. And I think what we look at is really, the trends. Where are things growing, right? Obviously, MENA region is an emerging market, and it's a very high growth rate. So those are the ones that we're going to prioritize.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty much more or less a standard definition. You're talking about Southeast Asia. China is, to some extent, an emerging market. Middle East is an emerging market, as well as Africa. I mean, really, the non-emerging markets, in a way, are more easily defined as European and American markets. Yeah. I also, we do definitely make the same kind of distinction. So the challenging markets are the ones really that we defined internally, are ones that we actually could not penetrate by simply localizing the product.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. And those include countries like Japan, Korea, Russia, and Brazil.
So I'd say we have a similar perspective on which markets fall into the emerging markets category. From a business perspective, similar to, I think, Facebook, every member adds value to the ecosystem of the network. And so from that perspective, we do what's needed to maximize the growth and adoption of our website to people in those markets, both from again, a localization from a translation perspective as well as adaptation of the product. We then focus separately in terms of which additional efforts we will do to monetize those markets based on other weighting and analysis factors in terms of minimum member base and growth in each of those markets, because we also have limited resources as startup.
I found that comment very interesting about there's certain markets that it's not simple translation. Would you be kind to elaborate maybe, and if each of your companies actually face, if you can mention maybe an example, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned examples of countries. So really, I don't know if I were to categorize the countries that are challenged. You have countries where, for example, there was someone that came to the market before us. I'll give an example from related to orchids, for example. India and Brazil were orchid countries. But those were challenging countries. Those are not the kind of countries that you could. People are passionate about the use of orchid. They love orchid, and for you to be able to win, you have to do a lot more than just translation. Okay. Another market that was very interesting actually was even Germany. Germany had a website that's called StudiVerzeit, which was actually a copy of Facebook. And for a long time, it was actually hard. It was kind of like a double experience for me because I used to be at PayPal before, and Germany was a challenging market, mainly because the Germans don't use credit cards, and they don't have to pay for transactions. So we thought it was going to be equally challenging. It turned out not to be as challenging, and we can talk a little bit later about how we address these things. India, by the way, we are now the #1 social network in India. Japan had, so basically it's all mainly because there's already an existing product that was very, very popular in that country. China is a complete, like if you talk about about an emerging market, China is a completely different ballgame, and maybe you can address it later.
Sure.
So in terms of variations, fortunately in the professional networking space, we don't see a lot of variation globally in how professionals network online. It makes my life a lot easier. That said, there are things that, there are differences and things that we focus on to try and understand each of those markets. Japan is one, China is one, some of the Latin American countries also, where the way people interact professionally with one another is different due to social norms and behaviors. So we are starting down that path, and there's not a lot that we've done to date in terms of customizing our product, but we definitely recognize that changing what we do and how we do it and how we offer our service to members in many of those markets will need to change over time to be relevant and adopted highly in some of those markets due to the cultural differences.
One could argue that each of your prospective companies address different segments of people. Could you talk about that a little bit, and how are they different, and where do they also sort of, if there are some certain segments that you both target at the same time, if you could mention that as well, some examples. Please.
Sure. So I think most people we talk to around the globe view, when talking about the networking space, view Facebook as the social networking and LinkedIn as the professional networking space, as most people like to maintain those two circles of networks distinct from one another. Most people like to keep their vacation photos separate from their business colleagues. And that's a distinction that we find most people have around the globe, which is beneficial. I think the search space is pervades across all members globally, and I would say there's probably more of an interesting discussion between the different search providers, whether there's what are the key differentiators there in how they address emerging markets as well. Perhaps Bob can talk about how Google differentiates itself in some of those markets versus some of the other search players. But in terms of the networking space, I'd say Ghassan and I probably agree on that generally. There's some markets where there's some overlap, but in general people like to keep those, the professional and personal distinct, and most people use Facebook for the personal, and then LinkedIn, or in some markets there are other additional local copycat sites as well for the professional side.
Yeah, I don't actually. I mean, of course, the origins, the genesis of Facebook is a college network, but since it opened up, I don't really feel that we actually do focus specifically on particular segments. We try to be all-inclusive. And I mean, I can't talk for Bob, but I would imagine similar thing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with search, it's pretty pervasive among all segments. But you will see that different cultures have different interests, you know, entertainment or whatnot. The types of search done in different markets will vary. The types of queries you'll get is different. So in terms of like trying to tune our search quality in a way, we are tuning it to, you know, in a lot of Asian markets, entertainment searches are much higher than say the US, where there's probably more news and that sort of information. So you can think of that in a way with a segment, that we do have to make sure we're tuning our results based upon interests that maybe it's the same demographic, you know, people this age, that age, or male, female, they're probably very similar, but their interests do vary. You know, I think obviously search is our big thing. Social is becoming huge. A lot more people are using social aspects for searching, so we're looking at how to, you know, bring more social relevancy to our search as well.
So the other question is, to what extent does targeting a certain emerging market affect the direction of your products? Whether it's from a product development standpoint, marketing it, etc. Examples, please, yeah.
So I would say a lot, especially when talking about emerging markets. I mean, the main factors there, so I'll give you just some examples about what we've done over the last 2-3 years. At some point when we were trying to get into India and be successful, I actually ended up going to India and spent some time there. We released 6 languages. Language adoption, local language adoption by Indians is extremely low by comparison with other languages. Because let's face it, I mean, I actually, even though I've been in this whole space for over 20 years, it was like a very interesting experience to be there, to watch TV, the equivalent of, what's that show where they have those guys and girls living together and they start fighting, you know, real world. So there was like the equivalent of this real world in India, and I'm like, and at some point they start swearing at one another and they swear in English. So I could, even without knowing a single word of Hindi, I could actually understand that show. So I'm like, okay, is there really going to be a lot of adoption of the Indic languages? And indeed, it was pretty low. So one of the things that we wanted to target there is like, okay, the bandwidth in India is pretty low, so we created this product that's called like.facebook.com. Okay, we retired it. Some of the aspects of the product ended up, being rolled into the main product. But basically, from the name, it was a lighter product that contained where the images are lower resolution, so they don't require as much to download and things like that. The product itself was lighter on the features. But then, really, the thing that had, I would say, the largest impact is the focus on mobile. And I think that's something that you probably would hear from everyone in this space. Indonesia is our 3rd, I believe, or 4th largest country. 3rd, thank you.
4th is Turkey.
No, Turkey is lower now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But Indonesia, we localized into Indonesian, and interestingly enough, we experienced like easily a 5-fold increase in user base. And we focused on mobile. I think the BlackBerry is huge in Indonesia. And then before you know it, that country was just unbelievably like big. And so the highest percentage of user base where mobile is actually the main medium is actually Indonesia. So you have Indonesia, you have India, you have a whole bunch of other companies. And those are the ones that actually ended up growing great because of mobile. And you might have heard about something that we call Facebook for feature phones. So there are like about 2,500 carriers that, phones. Those are the ones that they're not smartphones. So we actually created a Facebook product for those, and we teamed up with the carriers in order to offer Facebook access for free over a certain period of time, and that also helped out a lot. Plus zero. So we've done quite a bit. All of these initiatives are not to target countries like the U.S. and Europe. These are all initiatives to target those countries. Number two, wow.
So correction, yeah, Indonesia's number 2 country on Facebook. So how does our focus on emerging markets change our product development? Not much, partly because we focus on the professional space, and there's a higher adoption and availability of connectivity to computers. Yet, similar to what Hassan was saying, mobile is the one area where we do focus in meaningful ways on differences in emerging markets versus the developed world, because of the pervasiveness of and adoption of different, mobile in general is higher in many markets, and also particularly the different devices and different carriers. We work successfully where all professionals work, and mobile is a critical piece of that ecosystem.
Yeah, of course, as they both say, mobile is huge. I mean, the percentage of people going to be online mobile is proportionally much bigger in emerging markets. But even within emerging markets, there's distinctions there. Like I said, we're doing a lot of work with Africa. In Africa, really, we have to provide SMS solutions. We have to provide Gmail and SMS, that sort of thing. And we mentioned there's all the latency issues. That we're trying to get to certain markets. There's the latency issues. So how do you build your products to work better in the low latency markets? The other thing that we haven't brought up yet is sort of the whole social political issues. We talked about China, in India this morning, and we talked about the MENA regions. A lot of the emerging markets, India is probably an exception. There's lots of rules and regulations that we have to comply with local government laws. We also are trying to adhere to our principle of information and making information as freely as possible. And so we have to kind of walk that tightrope. And so things that we don't really need to focus on so much is in the U.S. or other more established markets is, how do we deal with takedowns? And you don't want to have to take down some content globally. You want to be able to take down for that country that's demanding you by their law how to do it. I mean, we have to have people on the ground because we don't take down things just willy-nilly. I mean, just even the U.S. has to do subpoenas, and then we have all sorts of legal groups to kind of fight those things, and we will try to resist when we think information should be protected or things like that, or information should be free. We'll try to fight those things, but that is a big distinction, as probably most of us in this room know, is dealing with the content.
Question, when you mentioned mobile, does mobile include pads, iPads, or any pad devices? Because I remember in one interview Mark Zuckerberg mentioned that he doesn't consider the iPad to be a mobile. So do you consider that to be part of your strategy as well? And the other question is, with the different platforms, like you said, for example, in Malaysia, it's more BlackBerry. You're seeing a wide range, with now with the Android also coming online. Do you see a certain operating system, mobile operating system, dominating this in the near future? What changes does that do in terms of your mobile strategy?
Well, I guess tablets, in terms of emerging markets, they're probably not there yet. And I guess a lot of the large iPads are not that mobile, I'd agree, but I think that will change. In terms of OSs, I think iPhone and Android, they've really opened things up. We no longer have the closed gardens that the carriers control, and I think that's radically going to change things. I think that's an unstoppable force at this point. And so I think the things that we do in the mobile space are going to be more geared towards the smartphones, the iOS, the Android.
Yeah, and I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. I don't think there are, because the figures are there, the data is actually there. And I was looking at some numbers where, I think it was last year, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, the smartphones went from being like maybe 30% or to like about 60%. Of course, the Android is growing at a faster rate than anything else. But, you know, we still, in a way, like essentially, we still focus on, maybe not as much, but we still focus on feature phones. I mean, we developed this thing, and until I guess everybody is on smartphones, we're going to continue to do that. In terms of the iPad, I mean, if Mark said that, I'm not going to say that.
Very smart, very smart.
We do consider the iPad to be a mobile device.
Bob, you mentioned something really interesting about the socio-political issues.
Right.
And I think if anything in the Middle East has highlighted the role of democracy for companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google. So for the first time, we're seeing these companies actually take, whether they like it or not, have to take and engage in an active role in spreading democracy in these countries and being thrust into making some very difficult political decisions. How do you see this going forward in the near future, and how does your prospective companies plan on dealing with some of these issues?
I think there's a lot of individuals within Google who feel a certain way. I think Google as a corporation has to be very careful about what we say politically. One, just for the protection of our employees, right? Because we've actually had cases where our employees have been questioned and been brought in and things like that. So I think Google tries to draw the line of making information as freely available as possible and not necessarily bring up the word like democracy. That's not probably the corporation. And we have people, as we all know, a famous person in Egypt, but that was really his personal decision that I think a lot of Googlers personally were proud of, but I don't think Google will officially endorse political use of our products.
So I know, Suleiman, that you and I met with last year.
Yes.
Okay. So the gentleman that actually started this whole thing on Facebook is a Google employee, and despite the fact that I am a Facebook employee and I have been there for 3 years, he had a lot more vision about what Facebook was capable of doing than I did. When he talked to me about it, I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. I honestly did not understand exactly what he was doing, I mean, he proved that the platform was very powerful. Facebook is not like Google, and I think we share a lot of the culture because we also have a lot of employees that work at Google and work at Facebook. You have some individuals who are absolutely passionately opposed to anything that has to do with any restriction or that we put within the site. And but you know, the general approach within the company is that you have to create there's a delicate balance between respecting local laws and at the same time keeping your integrity. And that's what we've done. An example, last year, for example, you might have heard about something that happened, I think drawing Muhammad on Facebook, and Pakistan, it's against the law to do that. They even actually asked the Interpol to go and arrest Mark Zuckerberg and bring him for execution. That was in the news. I'm not saying anything secret. We talked to them, and basically we decided that, you know, if it is against the law, we're going to do that. We're not going to necessarily block it all over the world, but we will block it in those countries where it's illegal. This is more of a mild case. In some cases, actually, it can get a lot more hairy, especially when they start issuing subpoenas to arrest people. So,
and we've had people had to leave certain countries because we didn't want them to get arrested until the political issues died died down.
We don't have as much experience as Google in that space. We haven't had any, apart from a few instances here and there, we haven't really had too many problems. In countries like China, we haven't actually attempted to go there. We translated the site, we decided to wait, we got blocked without even doing anything. We got blocked, maybe there will be a question about that, we can discuss that, but we avoided going there aggressively.
I would say we look at our friends down the street, Google, and in the next town up, Facebook, and try and take our lessons learned from both their experiences in many of these markets around the political sensitivities and the power of information. And we've always strived for clarity and consistency and control for our users to try and make sure that they have the right tools at hand to control how their information is shown, but consistency across the world at this point. But again, we do look to the experience of others and try and figure out the right path forward for LinkedIn based on their experiences.
Can I ask you?
Please go ahead.
Is this actually? You're more of a professional network. Is this as much of an issue for a company like LinkedIn?
Yes, it is an issue. LinkedIn was blocked in China for one day in this past month due to some of the activities in the Middle East, as well as concern by the Chinese government around the use of LinkedIn as a platform that could be used to organize protests that might be threatening to the Chinese government. At least that's how it was reported. So yes, it is a concern.
When I started Google 5 years ago, I think the same day I started was our first employee we worked in Washington, D.C. So I think Google is getting more and more sophisticated or less naive, whichever way we look at it. And we do spend a lot of effort, even in China, government relations and things like that. So that has become an important part of our doing business.
The other question is, Nico, you asked me that question when I was doing the earlier session, and it's about geography. What's the advantages of setting up shop in a local country versus in different countries? Advantages of having employees. I know you employ different strategies. Google has offices in Dubai, I believe, in Egypt. Facebook, they hired a friend of mine as a product manager recently, a young entrepreneur, but they moved in a Zurich office, I believe, in Switzerland. LinkedIn, I'm not really aware. You don't have any Arabic, for example, but maybe for other countries. So what different strategies does each company pursue, and why, if I may ask?
So LinkedIn is headquartered here. Most of our employees are here in Mountain View, and those offices that we do have outside the region here are primarily sales offices. And because we don't need to, and it's more efficient to have everyone in one place.
We have kind of a similar structure. I guess we're all geographically based in the same area as well. We have actually both sales and operations internationally. For obvious reasons, operations gives us access to time zone that's closer to our user base and customers. Plus, it also, especially in countries like Ireland, Dublin specifically, you have access to a large multilingual pool of people. We actually haven't set up all of our engineering at this point. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but all of our engineering is 100% actually is in Palo Alto so far. The question that we had is two aspects. One, if we're referring to competition with local companies, if there are some advantages and disadvantages, I think you already answered. Maybe not even in reference to the question, but if you're local, if you're competing with local companies, of course local companies have the advantage of being there, of understanding the culture better, of maybe having better connections with authorities and stuff like that, and of course access to the user base. And in some cases, there's the national aspect of being closer to, people feel proud of having a company that's more local. hasn't been a big issue for us. I mean, Maktub was probably the only one that was ordered on social networking, but other than that, that hasn't happened. But on the flip side, let's face it, we have a lot more resources and a lot more money and a lot more a global appeal than local companies, and that's a disadvantage for the local companies.
Google's put a big effort in trying to be in more places for a lot of reasons. One is the talent pool. I think we can expand the talent pool of the company because we can find good engineers, good product people, good marketing people. The wider we spread our net, so we can get people in the Middle East, the good people there to work for us on our products. And engineering-wise, we are spread out geographically, but not as much as maybe our sales office. I mean, we have, for example, the main team that works on a lot of our Arabic enabling is actually based in Zurich, but we do have the Cairo office, we do have the Emirates office, but they're more of a sales office. But I think it's really important to have those people on the ground to understand the users and the competition, those sort of things. So I think that we see that as very critical. We're very connected within the company as well. Every office has tons of VC rooms, video conferencing rooms, and I'm often in the morning with Europe and in Asia. I think having that local connection is very important to us.
I'll tell you something from our perspective in Jordan. There's a very strong rumor that Google tried to come to Jordan, but they assessed the market, and they decided that if they come in and open offices, they'd literally destroy all the local startups and all the local, because there isn't enough talent to go around, and they decided not to. Have you heard anything? Can you confirm that, or?
Do you want me to confirm that?
But because for us, actually, we were very pleased, and it's raised the stocks, the Google stock in Jordan incredibly. There was such a tremendous respect for that decision, and because some of the other companies just simply didn't care, and they caused problems for the local talent pools, especially in the development side. But a lot of people really respected Google for that, so kudos there. So I guess now we talked about this, we refer to it China. What I'd like to start with is first, the question here says the $64,000 question. I don't know why it's $64,000, but Danielle is here. No, he's not. So why is everyone trying to focus on China while empirically everyone has failed there, although that's subject to disagreement, I guess. And failures and successes in certain cases.
Well, okay. I mean, obviously, China is our most famous challenge market at Google. And I think the word failure is probably not the correct word. I mean, anyone that's doing the amount of business Google is doing in China, most companies would have to consider it a failure. We are having a successful business there. We are not number one, as we are in other parts of the world. We are not even a close number two, but we have a pretty thriving business there. So I think, and if you compare us to other U.S. or multinational companies, I think we probably have done a lot better than average in our success in China. We have not left China as a lot of people think we did. Basically, for a lot of you probably already know this. There was security problems. People were hacking into users' accounts, mostly using malware and things like that, and actually successfully hacking the Google software. There seemed a concerted effort to target people, especially human rights activists. And so, Google had gone in there saying, okay, we can try to live within these government laws about self-censoring our search results and that sort of thing. So all these things sort of culminated with these security attacks that, okay, we're not going to, we find that path not being successful. And it was hard to be true to our principles, and we're not necessarily serving our users as best as we could. So we moved our search systems to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, China is the, one country, two governments, or whatever they call it. And so there's no restrictions on, they can't impose the same legal restrictions. So the servers are based in Hong Kong and no longer have any self-censorship. We still do have some .cn services. We have like music and maps and some other things that are still in .cn. But and Gmail was never in .cn. Gmail is always in .com, partly because of these concerns of that we were trying to protect people's private information, and we did not want to be subject to another company who had to give up some email, and that person got sent to jail, right? So we did not want to be put in that position. So we never actually put Gmail servers in China. So, where am I going with this question? We're still working on China. We're still trying to be successful there. I think some of our strategies have changed to a more focused at export market. You know, one of the things that when we talk to users in China, they like Baidu for Chinese searches, but non-Chinese searches, they like Google because they get better results, they get less filtered results, but even better quality results. And so I think there's a lot of people in China who want to sell to people outside of China, and we've kind of refocused since this time on a lot of those customers. Although we're still trying to address the consumers as well.
So obviously we don't have much experience with China. Definitely not the kind of experience or any type of experience, by comparison with Google. A lot of people keep saying, why is it that everybody fails in China, like if they're not Chinese because of the local competition? And I actually disagree. Maybe in soft technology that may be to some extent true. But in reality, the Chinese consumer is pretty much similar to any other consumer. The auto manufacturers have been extremely successful. Pharmaceuticals are extremely successful. Companies like Coca-Cola and today like Apple and all of those companies are actually extremely successful in China. There are, in my opinion, like 4 different types of companies that have been able to succeed in China. One of them is those companies that actually went first to market. The second one is companies that produce really cool products. Designer companies, French designers and Italian designers. The Chinese pay, the average consumer in China does not earn a ton of money, but they, apart from the fake products, the Chinese actually, French products are extremely popular in China. Then you have a category of products that are of such extremely high quality. I'm not going to make a pitch for Apple, but it would be very hard for your average Chinese company to be able to come up with a product that actually copies the iPhone and offers the same kind of experience. Plus, of course, the iPhone is a cool product. And then you have products, especially those things related to pharmaceutical, where the complexity and cost of reproducing that product is actually extremely high. Okay, so having said that, why would a company that's already blocked without really doing anything, like Facebook, why would we bother with China? Well, 2 numbers. There are 400 million internet users and 700 million mobile users, approximately, of course. That's a market that you cannot ignore. You cannot ignore. And as I mentioned before, if we are going to be a global company, we really have to be really global. One thing that's interesting that you mentioned, which is that our experience with a lot of companies is that you're talking about like the Baidu versus Google search. You have exactly the same kind of experience. Google can, the local products, and there are probably hundreds of social networks now in China. Those are companies that offer you a local experience. As countries become more and more globalized, and as the connections of the local people spread all over the world, the local option is not very viable. So we actually believe that we can be successful in China. The trick is how.
I think that, again, we're recognizing the challenges that Facebook and Google have had in China. China is a market that has different constraints and influences, and realize that in order to be successful in China, we will need to invest more in people, technology, and potentially a different business approach, so that we don't end up blocked like Facebook has been, and or even in the difficult situation that Google has landed in terms of where there's a business philosophy that's been challenged. And that's a very difficult problem to address, presumably internally, on how to deal with that. So we, again, are trying to take our lessons from Google and Facebook and figure out the right plan before we proceed more aggressively with China.
Well, speaking for Bob Jung, not for Google, I think one of the big distinctions, you mentioned that there's goods and things like that, people are successful, but when we're talking about information, it's a lot different. The Chinese governments and other governments, this is absolutely critical to be able to control that information. So I think it's a much steeper battle for people in our industry as opposed to selling designer purses. So
sure. I actually did say that soft products like soft are different, of course.
Right. But the fact that we're information,
yes,
it's different, adds a different complexity to it.
Yeah, it's fear into many people's hearts that information might freely flow.
But you know what? The world is also continuing to change.
That's true.
If you saw the transformation in the Middle East, there's no reason why that kind of. I'm not saying that there will be a revolution, but there's no reason to believe that things are going to stay the same. And I used to be at some point like a professor in when I was young. And I actually taught at Iowa State University, and the whole program actually pretty much catered to Chinese students from mainland China. And that was like back in 1985. And when I look at the Chinese students that I had, those were all graduate students, but I look at the Chinese students that I had back in 1985, and I look at my Chinese friends today, you're not talking about the same people. You're talking about completely different people. And you don't want to wait until, I mean, you have to tread very carefully. You have to respect global laws to some extent, but there's really no reason to believe that China is never going to change.
And the question is, as a company, do you stay ahead of the curve? Or do you just wait until that change happens and then take action?
Well, I don't think, I mean, personally, this is not a Facebook, but personally, I think you have to stay ahead of the curve. You have to establish some presence, you have to prepare yourself, and you really, especially when dealing with a country like China. You know, China is an amazing country because, you know, you were talking about the Middle East, where, and I've been gone from the Middle East for over 30 years, so I don't really know the culture as much. But my experience is that the governments actually try to do everything possible to prevent the people from succeeding. I mean, in lots of respects. Okay. In China, that's actually not the case. I mean, the amount of money that the Chinese government pours into startups is huge, and they try to foster that kind of entrepreneurship versus the blocker.
I think it's the obligation of companies like Facebook and Google. We do have a certain amount of clout because of our size and our users, that we really should be pushing the envelope and not waiting for things to change, because I think we can be a part of that force that move things.
And I think the biggest example is the Middle East.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. Please, yeah.
We're talking a lot about India and Middle East, but I haven't heard much about Latin America. And it's one of the places that I hear everywhere that everyone wants to invest, but no one wants to invest and put the money there because most of the investments going to China again and Middle East. So what your companies are doing in Latin America, or what you're not doing and why?
I mean, I'll just give you like a 1 minute thing. We are actually huge in Latin America.
I know.
I don't know if it's public, but we're opening an office in Latin America, and that's one of the few locations where we are opening more than just a sales office.
And when does that, if I can ask again, when that decision was made and why? It was just to be ahead of the curve, like you said, or you saw the opportunity of having the talent over there as well?
Well, we have a big user base. As I mentioned before, all development work is still happening actually in the U.S. So we don't have like engineers that are going to be based in Latin America as far as I know. But we're opening, I believe, an operations center, user operations center. I mean, when you have, 60, 70 million users in that region, if nothing else, you want to be close to them and you want people who can speak their language. That decision was made, I think. I mean, of course, these things take a long time, but I believe the decision was made pretty recently.
We open offices in every major region around the world, including Latin America, based on member base and potential business opportunity there. So.
Yeah, we have offices in Latin America. We actually have an engineering, fairly good-sized engineering team in Brazil. Of course, we did a lot of work in Orchid, of course. And like I said earlier, we're seeing Latin America as one of our faster growing, in terms of rate of growth. And, we are looking at things like, in the past, companies tended to translate things into Spanish. And, we are looking at doing Latin American Spanish, and maybe even going beyond that as well. So we are looking at improving our offerings, but I think we have a pretty good offering in Latin America or not. Do you think Google's doing a good job, not addressing the Latin American market?
No, I think everyone is. I'm just asking more in a sense of what else you're doing. Because just having the office, like we're just talking about, it just, it gets to a point that is not enough. Just having the salespeople there, that's my question too, is just, that's enough. Or you're going to wait, like you're saying, you're going to wait, the shift goes and everyone, one person start going there and have operations and then everybody else is going to go.
There are things we do for that market. I mean, for example, my team, our international engineering team, one of the things we own is like supporting phone numbers. And the original Android code supported North American phone numbers. And now we support phone numbers all over the world. So, in Latin America is one of the more complicated, some of the countries in Latin America, some of the more complicated phone numbers to support. So we are doing some things, specific to improve support in these markets.
I have a question, probably mostly to Ghassan, but could maybe to the rest of you as well. Facebook branching into emerging markets, and I am in my own family a good representation of such. Being Russian myself and being married to a Venezuelan, we have a good representation of Facebook users from all over the world. And we, as our family, have the most frustrating user experience because my friends start adding my husband, his friends start adding me, they only communicate in Spanish. My gang, if they are in Russia, respond to everything I do in Russian, and then us two being in the US are doing it in English. Now, that's not my sneaky way of leading the conversation into the machine translation space, but the question is, I'm sure we're not the only ones like this, do you have plans of dealing with this mixed language content?
Yeah.
This is actually a very important question, and if I were Mark Zuckerberg, I would be doing machine translation today. Our resources are limited. We're growing. I would be very surprised if we don't actually do something about it. I can't really tell you that we have plans, but we're just definitely something on our mind. I'm the same like you. I'm not Russian. I'm actually originally Lebanese, but I have friends from Japan and China. And I would love to be able, and I've been in the localization space for 20 plus years, so naturally I have a lot of connections who speak different languages that I don't know. And I get frustrated, so what do? I highlight, go to Google Translate, and I translate it.
Yeah, well, that's our path as well.
Yeah.
Highlight,
so, I mean, yes, and especially, it's especially relevant for a website like Facebook. I agree with you.
Thanks.
So on LinkedIn, we have similar challenges where, with the global network, you have many people posting in many different languages in the network stream. What we find are two things. One is, most of the time, you see content in multiple languages with people you've connected, generally are in languages that you also can read. Otherwise, you probably are not connected to the right people. And then also, that we found that in our groups, most of our groups are monolingual, and that doesn't necessarily mean English. But you'll have a French Java developers group where most of the discussion is in French, or there's a Japanese development group for APIs on LinkedIn or whatever. There's sort of self-forming units that discuss primarily in a single language. So there's always an opportunity to do more through machine translation integration for multilingual group discussions, but we haven't found that to be a significant need because of the self-forming nature of people join the groups in the languages that they can communicate and read in. Otherwise, they don't generally find it useful enough, and they go find it a better group.
Actually, I just want to add one more thing. If you notice, like on the latest iteration of the profile, you're asked to identify the languages that you know. I'm hoping that we could use that information in order to lead towards some of that stuff in the future.
Right, Google has some pretty good machine translation technology. We cover quite a few languages. And I think what we're looking at is how we can build it into more products or make it available for other people to build more products. We have things like the translate element, so anyone can stick this, just a few lines of HTML, they can put it into any website they like. We have integrated translate built into the Chrome browser, so if it detects a page that it thinks is not in the language you're reading, it'll try to prompt you to see if you want to translate it. So we're looking at more ways of doing these sort of integration. You've seen, Google's also doing voice recognition work, and then we combine that with translate, so now you can actually have this conversation mode. You can talk to someone in a different language. So we're looking at taking this powerful technology and better integrating it to solve some of these type of problems.
So all the three of you mentioned about one of the biggest challenges in emerging markets is the government, dealing with the government, and Bob mentioned about creating a relationship, which is great, and I think that's the way to go. But my question is, do you rely on the sales team locally to have that relationship, create and nurture that relationship, or is something that it brings back to the headquarters to deal with it and solving those issues with them?
I don't know the particulars per country, but basically I think it's managed by our legal organization, not our sales organization in these contexts. I know in China we had a very good-sized government relations organization that would go and meet with the ministries and things like that. So it's not part of sales. It's actually more of a corporate-wide effort.
Yeah, and I think we have. I mean, it's a pretty common thing to have a legal team that deals with that. We have people that are called like policy people.
Right.
These are the people actually that deal with that kind of stuff.
Does LinkedIn also have some government
The
relations?
same.
Same thing?
Same approach.
Guess I'm the only one that's different here.
Yeah.
You're the government relations.
Yeah, I'm the government relations. Much closer to home. Actually, I would like the absence of government relations. But that's not a choice for me. Any more questions? Any last comments by anyone on the panel?
Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the panel. Please help me thank the panel. Thank you very much.